In the immense historical resting place where the vestiges of grand empires lie, their demise is typically marked by violent clashes. We envision Rome ablaze as barbarians breached its gates. We recall Napoleon's mighty army succumbing to the Russian snow. We picture the Spanish Armada shattering against the treacherous coast. We are taught to believe that global powers conclude their reign with a dramatic flourish, a significant military defeat that signals the end of an old era and the dawn of a new one. Yet, the British Empire, the most expansive dominion in human history, the empire on which the sun purportedly never set, did not fall on a battlefield. It didn't suffer a military loss to a rival force. It wasn't conquered by a foreign monarch. It was subjected to a financial seizure. The moment of its ultimate collapse occurred in a hushed, climate-controlled room in Washington, D.C. The instrument of its downfall was not a nuclear bomb or an armored division. It was a simple telephone call originating from the United States Treasury. This account details the Suez Crisis of 1956. For military historians, it chronicles a clandestine scheme, a poorly executed invasion, and a diplomatic disgrace. However, for financial historians, its significance runs much deeper. It represented the juncture when the world assimilated a harsh, undeniable truth regarding the global power structure in the modern age. It was the instant the United States leveraged its dollar to debilitate its closest ally, unequivocally demonstrating that military might is inconsequential without economic autonomy. To grasp how Great Britain stumbled into this perilous predicament, we must discard sentimentalism and confront the stark realities of London in the 1950s. Superficially, Britain still presented an image of formidable strength. King George VI and later Queen Elizabeth II governed a realm that encompassed a quarter of the planet. The Royal Navy continued to patrol global waters, from the Falkland Islands to Hong Kong. The pound sterling remained one of the globe's primary reserve currencies, facilitating trade from Singapore to Jamaica. In English classrooms, children still studied maps with vast territories shaded in pink and fervently sang Rule Britannia. Yet, this exterior masked a decaying financial core. Britain had financially exhausted itself battling World War II. To overcome Hitler, the British had metaphorically sacrificed their household possessions to maintain warmth. They had liquidated their extensive international investments. Railways in Argentina and mines in Africa were sold to procure American steel and Canadian wheat. Once these assets were depleted, they resorted to borrowing. By 1945, Britain stood as the world's foremost debtor. Its economy was precarious, sustained by an intricate, unstable financial network known as the Sterling Area. Nations within the British Empire deposited their national savings, denominated in pounds, in London. This afforded Britain a pool of capital, giving it a semblance of financial fluidity. However, it also rendered the British economy vulnerable, perched on a precipice. Should confidence in the pound ever erode, if these nations were to deem the pound insecure and hastily convert their sterling to dollars, the British economy would face a liquidity crisis that would dwarf the Great Depression. The British government harbored profound anxieties about this scenario. Every Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer would retire each night, preoccupied with the state of the gold and dollar reserves. These reserves functioned as the nation's savings account, the barrier holding back a potential deluge. They understood they were navigating a precarious path. It was imperative to project an image of strength to uphold the pound's value. Any perception of weakness would trigger market panic. The reserves would swiftly deplete, rendering the empire insolvent. The vital artery of this fragile empire was the Suez Canal. Carved through the Egyptian deserts, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, the canal was more than merely a shipping lane. It constituted the economic lifeblood of the United Kingdom. By 1956, two-thirds of Britain's oil supply transited through the canal. It served as the gateway to India, Australia, and the oil-rich regions of the Persian Gulf. Without the canal, British industries would halt, and London's lights would dim. Technically, the Suez Canal Company, a private corporation controlled by British and French stockholders, held ownership of the canal. It represented a vestige of the colonial era, a segment of Egypt under European proprietorship. It functioned as an autonomous entity within the state, operating under its own regulations and generating profits, most of which flowed north to Paris and London, bypassing the Egyptian populace. For British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, the canal held sacrosanct importance. Eden was a traditionalist, an aristocrat and diplomat who had experienced the turmoil of the 1930s. He had witnessed the consequences of global appeasement toward dictators like Mussolini and Hitler. He firmly believed that aggressive nationalism demanded confrontation, not accommodation. In 1956, he identified his contemporary dictator in Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was Egypt's charismatic and impassioned new president. He embodied the burgeoning movement of Arab nationalism. His ambition was to dismantle the chains of colonial domination and modernize his nation. His vision involved constructing the Aswan High Dam, a monumental hydroelectric undertaking designed to electrify Egypt and regulate the Nile's floods. Yet, such dams are costly, and Egypt was an impoverished nation. Initially, both the United States and Britain pledged financial assistance to Nasser for the dam, aiming to retain him within the Western sphere during the Cold War. However, Nasser engaged in a risky geopolitical balancing act, cultivating ties with the Soviet Union, formally recognizing Communist China, and acquiring weaponry from Czechoslovakia. In July 1956, the United States, exasperated by Nasser's deceptive dealings, abruptly withdrew its financial backing for the dam. Britain promptly followed suit. Nasser was enraged. He required funds to realize his grand project. If the West would not provide them, he resolved to seize them. On July 26, 1956, Nasser delivered a speech in Alexandria, a fervent proclamation of Arab independence disseminated across the Middle East. Midway through his address, he uttered a specific code word, DPEPS. This signaled Egyptian forces to mobilize. As Nasser spoke, soldiers occupied the Suez Canal Company's headquarters, taking control of its towers and offices. Nasser declared to the jubilant crowds that he was nationalizing the canal. He announced he would appropriate the toll revenues to finance the Aswan Dam. He famously proclaimed that the canal was excavated with their lives, their bones, their skulls, and their blood. In London, the reaction was catastrophic. Anthony Eden perceived this not merely as an act of theft, but as a chokehold on the British economy. If Nasser controlled the canal, he controlled the oil. If he controlled the oil, he could extort Britain. He could cut off the United Kingdom's energy supply at will. Eden informed his cabinet that Nasser was akin to Mussolini. He was convinced that if Britain allowed Nasser to succeed, British prestige would crumble. The sterling area nations would perceive the British lion as toothless, leading them to divest from the pound. The financial house of cards would then collapse. Consequently, Eden concluded that Nasser had to be neutralized. However, Britain faced a significant challenge. They couldn't simply invade Egypt. This was 1956, not 1856. The global landscape had shifted dramatically. The United Nations Charter explicitly prohibited aggressive warfare. Moreover, and critically, the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, firmly opposed the use of military force. Eisenhower, a military veteran himself, was also a pragmatist. Facing an election year, he sought stability in the Middle East, not a colonial conflict that would push Arab nations toward the Soviet Union. He cautioned Eden, explicitly and repeatedly, against military action, warning that the American public would not endorse it and that severe financial repercussions would ensue. Eden, blinded by arrogance, pain medication, and the lingering traumas of the past, disregarded these warnings. He convinced himself that Eisenhower's warnings were mere political posturing. He believed that once British troops were deployed, the Americans would eventually lend their support. He was confident this special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. was immutable, certain that America would never abandon its old ally. He was gravely mistaken. He was on the verge of discovering that, in the cold calculations of superpowers, alliances yield to self-interest. Prevented from an overt invasion due to American opposition, Britain devised a covert and illicit scheme. It was a conspiracy so audacious it would have shamed a crime boss. They allied with France, who also harbored animosity toward Nasser for his backing of Algerian rebels against French rule. A third partner was brought into the fold, Israel. The strategy was secretly formalized at a private estate in Sèvres, near Paris. It was christened the Protocol of Sèvres, and it stands as one of the most duplicitous documents in diplomatic history. The plan unfolded as follows. Israel would launch an invasion of Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, targeting the canal. This maneuver was designed to appear as a localized conflict between two long-standing adversaries. Following this, Britain and France would issue an ultimatum to both parties, demanding their withdrawal 10 miles from the Suez Canal zone to safeguard international shipping. When Nasser inevitably rejected this demand, Britain and France would then launch their invasion. They would present themselves not as aggressors, but as peacekeepers, intervening to rescue the vital waterway from wartime chaos. Their objective was to seize the canal, depose Nasser, and reinstate the former order. It was an intricate and elaborate deception, crafted to provide Britain with a justification to reclaim its asset without appearing as a colonial aggressor. However, while military commanders meticulously planned troop movements and diplomats refined their fabrications, the British Treasury was flashing stark red alerts. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, was deeply concerned. He scrutinized the financial records and perceived underlying weakness. Britain's gold and dollar reserves were alarmingly low, standing at approximately $2 billion. While this sum might seem substantial, for a global reserve currency, it represented the absolute minimum required to sustain confidence. Macmillan warned that a military conflict would be costly and would unsettle financial markets. Speculators might initiate a sell-off of the pound. He informed Eden that military action was only feasible if the United States supported it, or at least tolerated it. Should the U.S. oppose them, the financial strain would be unmanageable. Eden, however, dismissed these worries. He was consumed by the political objective. He believed that a swift, decisive victory would restore confidence in Britain. He envisioned that once the Union Jack flew over Suez again, markets would stabilize, oil supplies would flow freely, and the pound would be more robust than ever. He was making the archetypal error of a diminishing power, staking his nation's economy on a military gamble, presuming that military strength could rectify financial imbalances. He failed to comprehend that he was entering a trap where the actual battleground was not the Sinai Desert, but the trading floors of New York and Zurich. The command was issued. The covert protocol was activated. On October 29, 1956, Israeli paratroopers descended into the Sinai. The conflict had commenced, and the countdown for the British economy began. The lion was poised to roar, but it had forgotten that the American eagle was the one providing its sustenance. The imminent clash between the traditional empire of territorial dominion and the contemporary empire of financial might was about to unfold, with consequences that would reshape the world forever. On October 30, 1956, the day after Israeli forces swiftly crossed the border into the Sinai Peninsula, the trap was fully sprung. In London and Paris, diplomats meticulously crafted the document intended to legitimize the recapture of the Suez Canal. They subsequently issued a joint ultimatum to both the Israeli and Egyptian governments. The terms of this demand were breathtaking in their cynicism. The ultimatum insisted that both belligerent parties withdraw their military forces 10 miles from the Suez Canal's banks, ostensibly to ensure the safety of international shipping. To a casual observer in the West, this might have sounded like a neutral peacekeeping measure. However, for Gamal Abdel Nasser in Cairo, it was an egregious demand akin to a gangster's extortion. The ultimatum mandated that the Egyptian army retreat from its own sovereign territory, thereby relinquishing the Sinai to the invading Israelis, while simultaneously permitting British and French troops to occupy the Canal Zone, the very land Egypt had just nationalized. It was, in essence, a demand for capitulation disguised as a request for a cessation of hostilities. Nasser, predictably, rejected it outright. He fully understood its true nature, a synchronized colonial invasion. When the 12-hour deadline expired on October 31st, the pretense of diplomacy concluded. The Royal Air Force initiated Operation Musketeer. British bombers, taking off from airfields in Cyprus and Malta, thundered across the Mediterranean. They pounded Egyptian airfields, obliterating the Egyptian Air Force on the ground before any aircraft could even take flight. It was a potent demonstration of overwhelming, old-world imperial power. The skies were unequivocally under British control. At sea, a formidable naval force comprising aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers steamed toward Port Said. On land, Israeli tanks sliced through Egyptian defenses in the Sinai with alarming speed. From a purely military standpoint, the operation unfolded flawlessly. The strategy was unfolding precisely as planned. However, the British government had committed a critical error in judgment. They were waging a 19th-century conflict in a 20th-century geopolitical landscape. They erroneously believed that military triumph would silence their detractors. They assumed that once the Union Jack was unfurled over Port Said, the world would simply accept the fait accompli. They were mistaken. In the arena of global public opinion, Britain had blundered into a perilous situation. The timing could not have been worse. While British bombs rained down on Cairo, Soviet tanks were simultaneously rolling into the streets of Budapest to suppress the Hungarian Revolution. Western powers had been poised to denounce Soviet brutality, aiming to seize the moral high ground in the Cold War. But now, Britain and France, supposedly champions of democracy and international law, were acting in precisely the same manner as the Soviets, invading a sovereign nation to seize its assets. The United Nations erupted in condemnation. For the first time in the Cold War's history, the United States and the Soviet Union cast their votes in unison, both denouncing the invasion. Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin escalated the situation further, dispatching a chilling diplomatic note to London. He threatened to deploy all types of modern destructive weapons against London and Paris if they did not withdraw. It was a thinly veiled allusion to nuclear warfare. In London, the national mood rapidly shifted from jingoistic pride to genuine apprehension. Citizens began excavating trenches in their gardens. Newspapers screamed headlines about the potential for a World War III ignited by a canal in Africa. However, the true peril to Britain was not emanating from Soviet missiles. It was originating from the financial trading floors of New York. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was enraged. He felt personally betrayed by Prime Minister Anthony Eden. He had explicitly cautioned the British against using force and had been deliberately excluded from knowledge of the secret protocol with Israel and France. He viewed the invasion as a reckless colonial escapade that risked driving the entire Arab world into the Soviet bloc. Just days before facing the American electorate, Eisenhower resolved to impart a never-to-be-forgotten lesson to the British. He did not order the U.S. Navy to intercept the British fleet. He did not threaten to bomb London. He simply picked up the phone and contacted his Secretary of the Treasury, George Humphrey. The directive was straightforward: break the pound. The American financial offensive commenced subtly, but with devastating effectiveness. It constituted a novel form of warfare, imperceptible to the soldiers on the front lines, yet lethal to the nation that dispatched them. The Federal Reserve and private American banks began to divest their holdings of British pounds, flooding global markets with massive quantities of sterling. Simultaneously, speculators in Zurich, Paris, and New York sensed vulnerability. They recognized that Britain was embroiled in a war it could not financially sustain, acting against the explicit wishes of the world's dominant economic power. Panic ensued. Everyone sought to exit sterling and acquire dollars. The pound's value began to plummet precipitously. Under the regulations of the fixed exchange rate system, the Bank of England was legally compelled to uphold the currency's value. They were forced to purchase the pounds that everyone else was unloading. To achieve this, they had to expend their invaluable reserves of gold and U.S. dollars. The depletion was catastrophic. Britain was hemorrhaging millions of dollars in reserves daily. The National Savings Account, the essential funds for procuring food and fuel for the populace, was rapidly dwindling. In the cabinet war rooms in London, the atmosphere transformed from one of self-assurance to sheer terror. The military dispatches arriving at their desks were excellent. Paratroopers had landed, Port Said was being secured, and the route to Suez was open. However, the financial reports presented a starkly different, disastrous picture. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, watched the ticker tape with mounting dread. He observed the reserves nearing the critical $2 billion threshold. He understood the mechanisms of financial collapse better than anyone. He knew that once the reserves reached zero, the pound would inevitably have to be devalued or allowed to float freely. If that occurred, the sterling area would fragment. Britain would find itself unable to import essential wheat for bread production. The national economy would grind to a halt. The government would inevitably fall. In desperation, Macmillan attempted to secure financial relief. Britain was a founding member of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and had substantial funds deposited there. It was their money, and they possessed the right to withdraw it in an emergency. Macmillan contacted the IMF headquarters in Washington to request an urgent withdrawal of $561 million. It was a substantial sum, sufficient to stabilize the markets and finance the ongoing military operation. However, the IMF did not answer to London. It answered to Washington. When British representatives submitted their request, they encountered a formidable obstruction. U.S. Treasury officials, acting under direct orders from the White House, informed the British that the loan was suspended. Their message was unequivocal. The United States would block all financial assistance to the United Kingdom until a ceasefire was declared and troops were withdrawn. Eisenhower then intensified the pressure. He conveyed through diplomatic channels that if Britain did not cease the conflict, the U.S. government would commence selling its substantial holdings of British government bonds. Such an action would trigger a sovereign default, instantly bankrupting the British government. It was an act of financial coercion on a global scale. The United States was, in essence, holding a gun to the head of the British economy. On November 6, 1956, the British cabinet convened in London for one of the most momentous meetings in British history. Outside, the news was triumphant. British paratroopers were advancing along the canal, mere days away from seizing the entire waterway. They were winning the war. Yet, inside the meeting room, Harold Macmillan delivered a bombshell. He stood and informed Prime Minister Anthony Eden that the nation was, in technical terms, insolvent. He stated that they possessed enough gold reserves for perhaps only a few more days. Beyond that, they would be unable to pay for imports, including essential oil, or to defend the currency. The choice was stark. They could secure the Suez Canal, or they could maintain a functional economy. They could not have both. Anthony Eden was shattered. He was a critically ill man, his body sustained by amphetamines to keep him alert and painkillers to manage the intense suffering from a botched gallstone surgery. He had staked his entire career, his reputation, and his nation's honor on this military venture. He genuinely believed he was confronting a new Hitler in Nasser and was safeguarding the very essence of the empire. However, he was powerless against the dollar. The imperatives of finance superseded the logic of warfare. The cabinet reviewed the figures and grasped that without American financial backing, the British pound would become worthless paper within a week. They voted to accept a ceasefire. The order was dispatched to troops in Egypt. The British commander on the ground, General Stockwell, was astonished. He was victorious, having the Egyptians in disarray. His tanks were poised to advance southward. Yet, he was now instructed to halt his forces just 23 miles short of their ultimate objective. At midnight on November 6th, the guns fell silent. Operation Musketeer had lasted only a few days. Britain had militarily humbled Nasser, crippling his air force and army, but Nasser had, in turn, politically and financially devastated Britain. The humiliation was absolute. The British Empire, which had once defied both Napoleon and Hitler, had been brought to its knees by a run on its currency. They had been compelled to cease a successful military campaign because their financial lifeline had been cut. But the ordeal was far from over. The ceasefire represented merely the initial step. Eisenhower was not content with a temporary pause. He demanded full capitulation. He insisted on a complete, unconditional withdrawal of all British and French troops from Egypt. Until the troops departed, the financial embargo would persist. The British attempted to negotiate, seeking guarantees. They desired the canal to remain under international supervision. They wanted Nasser to make concessions. They wished to salvage some dignity, but they had no bargaining power. This was because, during the conflict, Gamal Abdel Nasser had played his ultimate card. He had issued the command to sabotage the Suez Canal. The Egyptian Navy had deliberately scuttled 47 vessels, including cement carriers, old barges, and dredgers, directly within the waterway's entrance. They had physically obstructed the canal with wreckage. The British Empire's economic artery was severed. Oil tankers originating from the Persian Gulf could no longer reach Britain, forced instead to undertake the weeks-longer, immensely costly voyage around Africa. Britain urgently required oil, and the sole immediate source was the United States. However, Eisenhower refused to supply it, famously stating that those who started this war must boil in their own oil. The British populace began to experience significant hardship. The stark reality of their economic frailty was becoming painfully clear. Gasoline rationing was implemented, following the passage of the Motor Fuel Rationing Order. Every car owner in Britain received coupons, transforming driving into a luxury. Factories reliant on oil commenced slowing production. Home heating was reduced. The nation's financial reserves continued to deplete. The country shivered in the early winter cold, defeated and financially ruined. The special relationship was exposed as a fallacy. Britain was not an equal partner to the United States. It was a client state, a junior associate whose existence depended on adherence to Washington's directives. Ultimately, Britain completely capitulated. On December 3, 1956, the British government announced its unconditional withdrawal of all troops from Egypt. The instant this announcement was made, the financial spigot was reopened. The U.S. Treasury approved the IMF loan. The Federal Reserve ceased selling pounds. Oil tankers began to depart from Texas. The crisis had concluded.